All right, very, very quickly, I'm just going to say we're doing a couple of things here that are kind of cool. Tom talked about the green as in the scratch, the dinero, okay? Well, again, he's right, and we're going to hear another version of that is like, how do you use green to save green? And so our next speaker, Jim Blackburn, is going to focus on that.
Send me some information. We'll see.
Talking about ecosystem markets and future landscapes.
That was supposed to be 60
And I'll just say that
you got to watch out for him.
he and I have known each other for a very, very long time. We first crossed paths in the early 70s on a little project called the Woodlands.
Was that okay?
And so we've bounced into each other off and on all along, and he has been a gift to the environmental movement around here, and let's give him a welcome, please.
Okay, thanks, Glenn, and it's a pleasure to be here and talk about something that's really a new topic for me in a lot of respects, which is beginning to talk about ecosystem credits and the potential of a private market, frankly, in lieu of regulation, which is usually the pathway that a lot of communities go to protect green space and important natural areas.
Okay.
Let's see if I can make this. That's the pointer.
I hope you got all that.
Yeah, there we go.
Whoops.
Down? Go down. There we go. I want to start off by just noting two people that have been very important to me in my career that passed away just recently, Charles Tapley and Tom Colbert. Charles was a landscape architect here in town who taught me all I know about the bayous, and he, along with Don Green, who also recently passed away, taught me about the bayous. Tom Colbert more recently worked with us at Speed Center, and some of the work you'll see today they had a major role in. I want to emphasize something to begin with, and that's Houston has fabulous ecological wealth, and it is something that we just never talk about. And when I mean wealth, I'm talking about it in the birds and butterflies sense. If this was on the West Coast, the ecology of Houston was in North Carolina, if it was in California, you'd all hear about it. I think people know more about our ecological wealth in Europe than they do in Houston, because we just don't talk about these things. It's not in our value set. And part of that is because we don't value it. We don't have any monetary reference point. I've talked about my spiritual connection, the ethical issues. I've talked about why we ought to protect birds and butterflies my whole career. And I've litigated to try to do it. And I can lose an audience in Houston very quickly talking about those topics. If I talk about money and ecological systems, I can keep everyone's attention in this town. And so one thing I have learned is if I'm going to communicate, I need to talk in a way that people can hear what I'm interested in their hearing. Now, Robert Costanza is a wonderful environmental economist, and in 1997 he wrote really a groundbreaking article in Nature called The Value of the World's Ecosystem Services in Natural Capital. He had a whole bunch of co-authors, and this was really the environmental economist's statement that nature really does have value. I translated it into, it was on hectare basis, I translated it into acres because nobody in Texas understands hectares. And I put it in a book called The Book of Texas Bays, but it's about $11,000 an acre per year for like Galveston Bay system itself. It can be about $5,000 an acre for a marshland, about $9,000 an acre for algal mats of all things. But based on natural services that these systems provide, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the future. Well, I took this and applied it to the acreages around the various bays on the Texas coast, and our bays turned out being worth $22 billion a year in the services that they provide to us. And you take that over 50 or 100 years and you're talking some serious money. But one of the problems is no one actually is paying for these services. There's really not even a market for some of the things that Costanza valued. So while he created ecosystem dollars, he did it in a very scientific way. It wasn't a practical way. And so it kind of got lost because, oh, that's not real. So I want to change gears a little bit and talk about Hurricane Ike. Now, that's really real. Those of you that were here during Ike, kind of remember it. Ike was a huge storm, but was only, quote unquote, a Category 2 and did $25 billion worth of damage. I mean, if resilience is an issue or a question on the test, we failed. And that basically Ike didn't even hit us, but it hit Bolivar, and it hit it hard. And the human landscape was basically ripped up. If Ike had hit 30 miles down the coast, that could have been Clear Lake, that could have been the Houston Ship Channel, and we would all be talking differently today. This is a Harris County Flood Control District map of the depth of flooding from the surge associated with Ike. And look at how far that surge went. It went all the way to the mid-Louisiana coast. I mean, that goes as far as Lafayette and Vermilion Bay. It went all the way across to Grand Isle. That's water that went 10 to 20 miles inland, and in red, it's over 10 feet deep. Amazing amount of water that came in. On your left-hand side over here, it's a picture of the water flowing back off of Chambers in Jefferson County 4 days after Ike had passed. That's what that land looked like on the right-hand side 6 months to a year later. Bolivar didn't look like that 6 months to a year later, but the marsh did. So when we're looking at resilience and studying flooding, we got to thinking, well, that natural system's got something to teach us. So that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things we really got interested in pursuing at SPEED Center. And so we developed what we call a non-structural flood alternative. It's a way of creating resilience without building structures. And what we decided is if we could find an economy that could withstand flooding, that would be just as good as a built economy. If people could make money off of things that could withstand flooding, that would be very adaptive in terms of really meeting the needs of the community for economic activity and also having us not flood. This is the area that is 20 feet and lower, the dark shaded area in Matagorda, Brazoria, Galveston, and Chambers County. That dark area is 20 feet elevation or lower. We expect a reasonable surge expectation in the future is 20 feet at the coastline. Maybe higher, but at least 20 feet. We haven't seen that storm. Louisiana's seen it, but we have not. That is a very real possibility. And so we developed something called an ecological services transaction platform. Basically a way of saying we're going to try to put buyers and sellers together and try to find things out in nature to sell. It's basically working on environmental engineering principles, believe it or not. Environmental engineers, I mean, when I got a master's degree here in Rice after getting a law degree, and I learned how to build sewage treatment plants. And what environmental engineers do in sewage treatment plants is they get microbes and they feed waste to them and they allow the microbes to eat the waste. So basically it's using natural systems. It's just we contain them, put them in a treatment plant and run the waste through. And we were doing experiments at Rice that were just amazing. There were bugs that ate arsenic, there were bugs that ate cyanide. I mean, they can do all sorts of things. But it was engineering because we put it in a metal container and held our bugs in that place. And we also used the stream for its natural function as well. And it also degrades waste because bacteria is in the stream. But that's what environmental engineering is. So we just got to think, what if we used ecosystems from an environmental engineering standpoint, rather than building and containing nature, use the ecosystem, and basically see if we can have landowners become essentially the managers of those systems. We also began to look at market, because if there's no market, none of this is going to work. Regulation, primarily federal environmental law, which is what I've practiced my whole career, has created, sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally, markets in ecological services. We have sulfur dioxide trading under the Clean Air Act. It's a $4.5 billion industry. Conservation banking under the Endangered Species Act is $800 million a year and going up. We have allocation of catch under the Magnuson Fisheries Act. Under the Clean Water Act, we have wetland mitigation banking. The United States is covered with these banks, and that's a $3 billion industry. Carbon dioxide trading is just getting started. The California Carbon Exchange is setting up, and that's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground. It's called plants. Plants take carbon dioxide and put it into their root system and put it into their wood, the carbohydrate that they make. Transfer of development rights is occurring in various parts of the country. Natural resource damage assessments are being implemented by ecosystem services alternatives. So it's happening, but it's regulated, and I'm going to be talking to you about the voluntary as opposed to the regulatory market, which I think is about to happen in a big way. I want to tell you, though, some of the creative things that are going on. And it makes me smile whenever I hear about these. In Oregon, they had a problem with heat in the Willamette River. The salmon needed lower temperature in order to have optimal spawning conditions. Power companies were going to have to put chilling units of a greater intensity on the back end of their power plants. What they're doing instead, they're paying landowners to plant trees along tributaries, and they're basically evaluating the BTU removal provided by shade. And the landowners are getting paid to plant trees, and the power companies don't have to design a chilling unit. Now, that's environmental engineering of a totally different type. In Dow Chemical, down in Brazoria County, expanding their ethylene plant, we have a nitrogen oxide problem in Houston. It helps form ozone. It's one of the causative agents. Dow is seriously looking at whether they can get credit for NOx removal by planting 1,000 acres of trees. It's very much a possibility. Nitrogen and phosphorus is being traded. A system is being set up on the Ohio River by the Business Council for Sustainable Development. The Chesapeake Bay Bank exists, and nitrogen and phosphorus transactions are taking place where developers that generate nitrogen and phosphorus are paying landowners to plant essentially ecosystems that remove nitrogen and phosphorus. And in Sarah Mack over in Louisiana is planting marshes, and she's got them listed on the California Carbon Exchange, and they're basically selling carbon dioxide sequestered in Louisiana on the California carbon market. I'm telling you, this is going to be happening in a huge way in a lot of other areas very soon. So what do I think we can sell? I think we can sell flood storage, conservation of habitat to some buyers, carbon, absolutely. Various types of habitats have different values, which I'll show you here in a second. Oyster reefs. If we plant oyster reefs, if we make oyster reefs, landowners get coastal protection from it. I know some landowners right now that will pay some amount to get erosion control. You put an oyster reef 100 feet offshore, you will break the waves and you will protect the property. Oyster reefs, when you talk to a fisherman, where do fishermen go to fish? Reefs. Everybody knows all the oyster reefs. It's all on everybody's GPS system. It's not hard to fish. You just find an oyster reef and drop a shrimp down there. There's fish there. Why wouldn't Coastal Conservation Association members pay to create new reefs? They may do it. They remove pollutants, and in some cases you can harvest them. You get 243 pounds of meat per acre. Your wave heights reduced 60 to 75% with a nearshore erosion device. Coastal marshes, they're even more fabulous in terms of systems. You get carbon sequestration, so you have basically, in that case, businesses that may buy. You could sell to fishermen, and I'll show you what. For carbon, you get about 2 tons of carbon per acre of marsh per year. That translates into about 7 tons of carbon dioxide removal per acre per year. All the oil companies internally right now have internal projections of paying $40 a ton for carbon dioxide removal. So 40 times 7, $280 per year per acre income off of carbon. But look at those fish. You get about 8,000 white shrimp per acre and about 9,000 brown shrimp per acre over each acre of coastal marsh, and you get, what, 7,500, 7,600 crabs per acre. If you're a fisherman, that's where your fishery comes from, is from that marsh. And we can quantify it, and I think, frankly, we can find people that will buy and support it. Prairies, similar type of situation. There's carbon sequestration. You can run cattle, subtract out the methane produced from the net carbon, and you can still sell carbon. Again, we've got data. It's quantified. A lot of this will have to be verified, but we've got good information. And bottomlands, the hardwoods down on the coast, the Columbia bottomlands, which have been really worked over, partially denuded across large areas, could be restored, and we can sell these credits. And among other things, you get 29 million birds in those bottomlands. The little extra, perhaps a few birders might chip in a little money on this. And then coastal woodlots is a special area. A couple of the really interesting things. I was invited to a meeting downtown about a year ago. And this group of people from Shell had come up with an idea, and they had 16 kind of business school posters up around a conference room. And they were all of the money-making ideas that they had developed internally at Shell for carbon sequestration and ultimately selling carbon-neutral gasoline. Selling gasoline that has essentially the carbon footprint offset by a natural service. They figured out that you can paddock graze cattle. It's something that's being experimented on over in the Katy Prairie and a lot of different places around. And there's a way to graze to replicate the action of the buffalo, restore the native prairie, sequester carbon, raise cattle, and also restore the native prairie. And all of that is done to make money. And, you know, a lot of my environmental friends go, oh, man, just gives me the heebie-jeebies to talk about ecology and money. But on the other hand, if we can get money working for ecology, it will be one of the most incredible forces for protection and preservation. It will totally transform the conservation model in the United States if this actually were to happen. Go Google the film, Soil Carbon Cowboys. It was made by Arizona State University, and it basically lays out this concept of basically paddock grazing and the benefits of it. This is a slide the Nature Conservancy put together of what sea level rise will do to the marshes on the coast. We're looking at 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise if James Hansen is not right. I mean, if James Hansen's right, you can forget about all of this because it's going to be 10 feet by 2100. But 2 to 3 feet by 2100, you can actually migrate the marsh inland with that if you plan for it. And I think a lot of philanthropic organizations are very interested in that phenomenon. That may be a market. I'm sure all of you know what LEED's certification is. Look at all of these other ones that are coming or that are already out there. STARS is for universities. There's great competition for students trying to get ahead from an environmental sustainability rating standpoint. That's STARS. ISI is now for engineers. It leads for engineers. Sustainable Sites Initiative, it's the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center and the American Society of Landscape Architects and the United States Botanic Gardens guidelines on how to do sustainable landscaping. And the most difficult, the Living Building Challenge. All of these have offset concepts integrated into them, and you can get points for offsets. We've been told by people trying to get some of these certifications, we'd buy something locally if we could get it. And there's nobody providing this service right now. So this is a real opportunity, we think. And my favorite, give your spouse or significant other the offset of their carbon footprint for a present. Perhaps you'll get divorced, but, you know, perhaps not. But I think it's coming. I mean, how many very nicely intended but worthless material goods have you been given as a present? And to get something like your footprint being sequestered is not a bad alternative. And then you might actually want to buy storage capacity for floodwaters in certain high-risk areas where the development pressures would be expected to come and where the risk perhaps are going to be significant, like the area between the 15 and 20-foot elevation contour along the coast. The point is, we're trying to put together an exchange. We've got a GIS system that's being developed. It'll be operational probably around the end of the year to begin to basically tell buyers and sellers how they can get together. We're looking through everything from contract details. Most of these transactions we expect to be commodity contracts, and it's something that the farmers and ranchers along the coast are very comfortable with. We've talked to many of these kind of historic landowners along the coast, and they're all very open to this because they basically, all of them have been approached about selling and setting aside their land or selling conservation easements, and they don't want to do that. They want to keep on their land, they want to work it, but they would like to maximize income. And so we think it's a very real possibility. So this idea of combining ecology and economy as a strategy for the future is something that we've worked on. I worked on when we first got Houston Wilderness started, trying to get all of this set up in a way that might begin to make some sense for Houston. So these concepts now are basically maturing as we've looked at them over a period of about 5 to 7 years. Carbon economy, will it happen? Absolutely. When? It's a good question. I'm talking about voluntary. I'm not talking about regulatory. A voluntary market will happen when consumers demand it. Well, when's that going to happen? Well, watch out what's happening in Paris late November, early December of this year. It's going to be the global climate change conference, and I think it's going to be a blockbuster of a conference. The Pope Pope Francis put out his encyclical in the summer in anticipation of the climate conference in November, December. A lot of things are heading together for November, December. Coming out of that, I think, is going to be a renewed interest on the public's part about footprint. And if consumers decide they want to pay for carbon footprint, it will transform this whole concept. Sequestered gasoline will probably cost about 5 cents, maybe 10 cents more a gallon. You know, would you pay 5 or 10 cents more a gallon to buy gasoline that the carbon footprint had been sequestered in? I think many people would. And I think as more and more people realize that this weird weather we're having is very much related to this carbon that's being put into the atmosphere, which the scientists have known for a long time. I think when the public gets that, 5 or 10 cents extra a gallon becomes a very reasonable thing to expend, but they've got to have the land. Now, what will happen? Whenever this market develops, there is going to be a rush to get these credits. And there is going to be much more demand than there is land. And so it's going to be, at some point, a seller's market. And right now, there's no market. So it's going to be a very fast ramp up that occurs. And what we're trying to do is anticipate what needs to be ready, what needs to be in place whenever this market becomes realized. So this is a Tom Colbert inspired graphic. This is what the coast may look like in the future, with carbon farms, with both flood storage and carbon farming occurring in the coastal area. You could take that same idea up to some of the area that John Jacob has done a lot of work with. These are the wetlands that were up on White Oak Bayou, up in the upper part of White Oak Bayou. That's right there is US 290. In the early 90s, I believe, is about when this was taken. We've come in, we've covered that up. We could have bought and set aside those wetlands up there that held all of that water naturally, but we didn't. And much of that water has now ended up down White Oak Bayou watershed. What you see in yellow here are areas that have been bought out by either FEMA or Harris County Flood Control District. And that land is expensive land. I mean, when you buy out houses that are flooded, I mean, if you assume 4 houses per acre at $150,000 a house, I mean, that's $600,000 an acre. $1 million an acre wouldn't surprise me. High dollar real estate. Much of that land could have been bought for $5,000, $10,000 an acre in the upper watershed, and it held that water up there. That's ecological service. That natural sponge is an ecological service. Now, we've lost the opportunity on White Oak to some extent. We still have it out west. This is, again, another John Jacob map, just mapping where some of our sponges is that's left on the west side of town. Same concept. You can have flood storage and carbon farming on the west side of town. Freshwater wetlands are a little more difficult from a carbon standpoint, but the prairies work perfectly well, and that's usually intermixed. And it just, I mean, it's just ripe right now before it gets developed. If it gets developed, we will have a different reality. And right now, if you're a landowner, you don't have any income source other than probably selling your land, because your rice market's pretty well gone. The cattle market doesn't compete with the real estate market. The carbon, the flood storage market just might. And how about clean water? Natural areas, wetlands, forests, do a wonderful job of filtering water. City of New York did a beautiful job, well over 100 years ago, to basically recognize ecological services and buy and set aside forest reserves to protect their freshwater supply system. New York's got the best freshwater supply system in the United States because somebody bought ecological services at an earlier time. We have a largely undeveloped watershed of Lake Houston. Now, we do have 300 sewage treatment plants discharging into Lake Houston. That's something we're going to have to probably do a little work with. But that opportunity exists in that whole area for that watershed to be bought for water purification purposes and carbon storage and all of these birds that are being talked about, which is a very real thing. So I would tell you my long-term vision for Houston is to have Houston with a circular economy. That term's thrown around a lot. It doesn't mean the same thing to all people. But if you're sequestering carbon, you're restoring the carbon cycle. If you're watching your water supply situation, if you're particularly watching the increase in flooding downstream by trying to protect your sponges, you're working with the water cycle. If you protect your marshlands, you're working with the, in this case, the crab cycle. Shrimp are exactly the same way, so are finfish. Everything circular comes in and out of that estuary system. And then I realized, and we've got one more circle. We've got the birds, the migratory birds, most of which includes most birds. And so you begin to think in terms of a circular economy, one that takes these straight line projections that basically run us afoul of every limit we've got and begin to bend it and turn it into a circular economy. And you begin to talk about a system that can last for generations and generations. And we've got the raw material to work with and make it happen here. And actually, economics is a mechanism that has not been used and absolutely should be used. And that's what I have to say, and thank you for listening.
You know, it's great stuff. I'm happy to see these ideas getting more and more traction. One of the things that's come up, you know, when we've talked about this is that unlike carbon, which, you know, if you offset carbon in Louisiana versus California, it's a global thing, so it's not, you know, the spatial context isn't as important. How would an exchange take into account the more localized spatial context of something like NOx emissions, where if I'm offsetting in an area that doesn't have a NOx problem for an area that does have a NOx problem, I haven't really solved the problem.
I think you're going to have to be regional, if not local, on some of these solutions. You know, that type of air pollution is absolutely going to be related roughly to something called an air shed. With regard to flooding, it's going to be a much more localized concept. The birds, however, you know, the bird watchers up in the Midwest, the bird watchers up on the Northeast, that's where their birds come through Texas. And so they've got a stake. Fishermen that use this area may be coming from other areas. So we see ways of expanding markets, but in terms of global, it probably is going to be birds and carbon. The water issues will be more local. We're looking to whether we can increase the water supply by restored prairies. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that we can do that. That would probably create a statewide market for enhanced water supply purposes. So, but you're right, you're going to have to tailor these markets, and what we're doing is we're trying to find the buyers, both locally and nationally. The other thing, I mean, we love about this carbon situation, it's kind of funny, the thought has been proposed that perhaps we could pit Silicon Valley against the oil companies, because the Silicon Valley always likes to talk about how much better than they are. Well, if they decide to come into Houston and buy carbon rights, oh, that would be fun, because then we could perhaps get a bidding war going, which I would love to see.
Okay, one more. Jim, are there examples of best practice guidelines that are, if followed, for example, in the coastal counties, could be used to decrease property taxes or something like that for homeowners?
In terms of decreasing property taxes, I'm not sure about that. I mean, if anything, some of the things we're talking about may increase property taxes because they would increase cash flow. I think it would be the traditional exemptions, either the wildlife exemptions or the farming, the ag exemptions. I think they're about the best you can do. I think what we can do is we can optimize income under those exemptions. And I think that would be probably the best we could hope for.
So I'm thinking about best practices as, I live in Fort Bend, we have tons of development pressure. I saw in some of your illustrations or graphics that some of these places, in fact, it looked like where I live is supposed to be a sponge for...
Again, that may have been already paved over, but that was one of John's earlier slides. But
I'm wondering why, for instance, our friend Morrison, why we're not producing some guidelines and best practices that could make it easier for developers to develop in a smart way if they set aside protection.
there's a lot of engineers that are working on what are called LID concepts or low impact development concepts. There's a lot of good information out there about LIDs. So there are best management practices being developed for those that are working with the development side and helping them minimize footprint, which would be primarily hydrologic or ecologic footprint. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.